The air is cool and damp, and under the moss the ground feels firmer, rougher, and older than it first appears. Across southern Iceland, the lava plain of Eldron stretches out in low, dark swells, softened by green. At a distance, it seems almost gentle, a quiet field resting beneath cloud and pale light. But as your eyes settle, the surface begins to feel unusual. The rises do not quite behave like hills, and the hollows between them seem less carved than left behind. This is land that spread outward while it was still molten, basalt flowing in broad sheets, then cooling into a crust that preserved its motion. Even now, beneath the moss, the plain keeps the shapes of pressure, collapse, and slow drainage. What looks settled is really a record of movement, held still for centuries in stone. And the longer you remain here, the more this calm green field begins to reveal itself as a frozen surface that never fully became ordinary land. If you follow one of these low swells with your eyes, it does not lead toward a summit or even toward a clear ridge. It simply rises, folds, and loosens again, as if the ground once pushed forward and then paused where it could. That is the first real strangeness of Eldrom. It does not feel built in the ordinary way, by layers of soil, or by rivers cutting channels, or by long weather shaping patient slopes. It feels spread. It feels as though the landscape arrived here in a broad dark sheet, then stopped before it had time to decide what kind of land it wanted to become. That impression is not only visual. Even under the moss, the footing changes from one step to the next. One patch feels springy with moisture and fine roots. The next seems to hide broken stone, sharp edges, and gaps between blocks, as though the soft green cover is resting on something unfinished below. And because of that, the plain begins to ask a quiet question. Not when was this made, though that matters, but how can something born in motion remain so visibly in motion after it has hardened into rock? The answer begins in the late 18th century, when the Larky Fissure opened across this part of Iceland and released basalt in astonishing volume. Not in one sudden cone, and not in one symmetrical mountain. Instead, fire emerged along a long tear in the crust, and from that tear, lava began to move outward across the land in wide, low, persistent floods. That choice of word matters, floods, because here the fire behaved less like a pile of rubble and more like a dark liquid system traveling over distance, filling depressions, overtopping barriers, and making a horizontal landscape instead of a vertical one. So the plain before you was not assembled piece by piece, it was poured. And once you understand that, each moss-covered rise becomes less like a hill and more like the wrinkle of a cooling surface. Each shallow hollow begins to look less like erosion and more like the place where lava subsided, drained, or sagged after heat moved elsewhere. It changes the way you read the ground. You stop asking where the field begins and ends, and start wondering which parts once flowed together as one continuous skin of molten basalt. There is a temptation, standing here, to walk straight across it, to pick a distant line in the moss and move toward it, trusting the plain to behave like open country. But the land gives a different instruction. The repeating swells, the hidden gaps, the subtle banks of broken lava under the green suggest that the better way is to follow the shape of the flow itself. So that becomes the first decision. Not to cross the lava plain as though it were a meadow, but to move along one of its old pressure lines and let the frozen motion guide the path. Once you do that, a pattern begins to emerge almost at once. The rises are not random. They arc and gather. Some narrow into ridges no higher than a person's knee, then spread again into bulbous mounds. Others look as though a crust once wrinkled under compression, while molten rock beneath kept pressing onward for a little longer. These are small clues, but together they point to a larger truth. The surface of Eldron is not simply the top of a lava field. In many places, it is the cooled roof of a process that continued underneath. Basalt of this kind is relatively fluid, compared with thicker, stickier lava. That fluidity is what made the plain possible. Instead of piling up close to the vent, the melt could travel. It could widen into lobes, spill into channels, and spread in immense sheets across the southern lowlands. The result is strange because the land still remembers that style of movement. A mountain tends to reveal its making in height. A lava plain like this reveals its making in posture. It lies the way water lies after a current has gone through it. There are places where the moss thins and black stone shows through in rough, clinkery edges. Those edges matter too. When the outer surface of a flow cools and breaks while the interior still moves, it can leave behind jagged rubble at the margins and smoother textures where the molten core continued to slide beneath a hardening shell. So even in a quiet patch of exposed basalt, there can be evidence of two different tempos at once. The outside cooling, the inside still going. That is why the plain feels so slightly unsettled, even now. Not because anything is moving today, but because the final form preserves a delay. The crust became solid before the whole system was finished changing, and where that happened, the lava could buckle, drain, collapse, or wrinkle into the shapes now hidden under moss. A few steps farther on, the repetition becomes more persuasive. One low rise resembles the next, and the next after that, until distance itself seems to flatten. The plain does not offer obvious landmarks. It offers texture, dark swells, soft green domes, shallow troughs between them. At first, that sameness feels simple. Then it begins to feel immense, because repetition on this scale does something unusual to the eye. It removes the easy measurements that trees, cliffs, or sharp horizons usually provide. A rise nearby can look much like one far away. A hollow a few steps ahead can echo another far in the distance. The effect is calm, but slightly disorienting. The plain does not hide itself by dramatic size. It hides itself by pattern, and that pattern traces back to the way basalt advanced. As each new surge met cooling edges, the surface could thicken in places, split in others, and create overlapping lobes. What you see now as broad, subdued relief may once have been the front lines of separate pulses, each one slowing, crusting over, and being nudged by lava arriving from behind. That means the field is not one smooth pour. It is a layered record of repeated forward movement, a succession of dark expansions that settled into one another. The more closely you look, the less the plain resembles a final product. It looks instead like a paused sequence. This is where the history of the eruption matters again. The Laki eruption, beginning in the year 1783, was one of the great basalt outpourings of recorded history. It continued over months. That duration shaped the land just as much as the volume did. A brief eruption might scatter material, build steep features, then stop, but a long basalt event can sustain movement. It can keep feeding channels and sheets. It can build crust overflow, then send fresh molten rock beneath that crust, extending the field farther while preserving older surfaces above. So time itself is part of the structure under your feet. Not just the fact that lava came here, but that it kept coming. The consequence is visible in the plain's low oceanic geometry. Nothing towers, nothing demands attention with drama. Instead, the whole region seems to have exhaled outward and then gone still. The weather helps soften that impression. Cloud light in Iceland rarely comes from one hard direction. It spreads, it settles, and over Eldrown that soft light smooths the ridges and rounds the hollows even further. But softness is deceptive here. The moss is real, the dampness is real, the hush is real, yet beneath all of it lies a very young kind of bedrock, geologically speaking. This ground has not passed through the long ordinary sequence that turns raw rock into familiar countryside. It has only begun. That is another reason the place feels so unusual. You are looking at land in an intermediate state. Not fresh lava anymore, but not fully translated into standard terrain either. The volcanic structure still speaks clearly through the skin of living green, and the moss does not erase that structure. If anything, it reveals it more gently. Where bare lava might dazzle the eye with black complexity, moss simplifies the surface just enough for the deeper forms to show through. It fills small crevices. It drapes over broken clinker. It rounds sharp transitions. And because it does, the larger architecture of the flow becomes easier to read. A low-pressure ridge appears as a smooth green back. A collapsed section becomes a dim hollow. A rough lobe edge becomes a dark seam beneath velvet growth. The plain starts to resemble a cast made from motion, a mold of heat. There is a long habit in human perception of treating green landscapes as settled ones. Grass suggests pasture. Moss suggests softness, rest, and old silence. Here, that instinct is gently interrupted. The green surface is not false, but it is incomplete. It belongs to the climate of southern Iceland, where cool air, frequent moisture, and slow biological growth allow moss to colonize rough volcanic ground with remarkable persistence. But the form it covers remains volcanic in a very direct way. This creates a double reading of the land. One part of the mind sees a field, the other sees a lava sea that has stopped mid-wave. Both readings are true, and the tension between them is what makes Eldrown so difficult to file away as ordinary scenery. As the path follows another long rise, the plain begins to reveal smaller structures within the larger swells. A slight crease runs along the top of one mound. Nearby, a shallow trench bends around a lobe-like edge. These details are too systematic to be chance. They suggest the crust once flexed and fractured as material below continued to shift. In active lava fields, cooling surfaces can behave almost like skin over slower liquid. They crack under tension. They wrinkle under compression. They can arch where pressure builds, then sag where support drains away. Eldram keeps those gestures, not dramatically, not as exposed spectacle, but quietly everywhere. And that quiet abundance matters. A single strange ridge might feel accidental. A whole plain composed of preserved mechanical behavior becomes something else entirely. It becomes evidence. The field is not merely covered in lava, it is made of lava's habits. This is why crossing it directly would miss something essential. If you walk only toward a destination, the plain can seem repetitive. If you follow its structural lines, it begins to read like a map. One rise explains the next. One hollow suggests a former margin. One dark seam hints at a cooling front or a collapsed zone. Bit by bit, the field starts to disclose its grammar, and in that grammar, nearly every feature points back to a basic cause. Hot basalt advanced. Its outer surface cooled first. That crust trapped heat inside. The interior kept moving. Then, depending on supply, slope, and cooling rate, some sections inflated, some drained, and some broke under their own changing support. The shapes left behind are the plain. There is something deeply quiet about that chain of events now. Fire, movement, pressure, and heat usually belong in the mind to moments of noise. Yet here their record is almost mute. No steam rises, no glow remains, only the patient geometry of what happened when molten stone behaved with the broad, spreading logic of water. And that comparison grows stronger the longer you stay. The plain has channels without rivers. It has pooled forms without lakes. It has levee-like margins, subtle overflows, and low surfaces that seem to have congealed while still remembering flow direction. This is not an illusion. Basaltic lava can indeed make landscapes that mimic hydrology, because when it is hot and fluid enough, it moves by some of the same physical principles. It responds to slope. It follows paths of least resistance. It can crust over on top while continuing beneath. It can leave drained conduits. So a lava plain may hold the logic of a river system, even after the river was fire. That realization leads naturally to another question. If the lava once moved here in channels and under crusts, then what remains of those inner pathways now? The surface alone cannot answer. In fact, the more coherent the upper pattern becomes, the more strongly it suggests an unseen interior. A plain built this way is unlikely to be solid in one simple block. It is more likely to contain voids, layers, fractures, and cavities left behind as molten rock withdrew from places where a crust had already formed. Even before any opening appears, the idea changes the walk. The mossy rises no longer seem merely soft or irregular. They begin to feel roof-like. Some slight depressions no longer read as hollows worn from above, but as places where support from below may once have changed. A curve in the ground might trace the line of a buried tube. A sag might mark an old chamber where heat persisted longer than the surface suggests. The plain grows deeper without visibly opening. And because the climate here is cool and damp, the hidden life of the rock has never quite ended. Water enters the fractures, winter cold moves into cavities, air lingers in spaces under stone. Moisture gathers where the texture allows it. What the eruption built as architecture for moving lava later became architecture for weather. That is the next layer of strangeness. The field did not simply cool and stop. It kept interacting with the world through the spaces its own formation created. A small line in the moss ahead begins to draw the eye. It is not a stream, though at first it almost suggests one. The depression is too dry, too dark at its edges, too precisely folded into the surrounding swells. It bends in a way that seems inherited rather than eroded. Following it means leaving the broader rise and dropping slightly into one of the shallow troughs. That becomes the next decision, to step down into this faint line and treat it not as a gap between mounds, but as a clue. The change is subtle but immediate. Inside the depression, the walls are not walls at all, just slightly raised shoulders of moss-covered lava on either side. Yet the form holds together over distance. It behaves like a route, not a path made on the lava, but a path made by the lava. And once that possibility settles in, the whole plain begins to reorganize around it. Because if this trough is the remnant of a drained channel, then the low swells nearby may be former banks, crusted margins, or inflated lobes beside a once moving core. The ground stops feeling random. It starts feeling internally planned by heat and flow. That does not make it neat, it makes it legible. The hollows are no longer empty spaces between features. They are features, places where lava traveled, thinned, or later withdrew. Places where the landscape kept the absence of what once passed through. And that is perhaps the deepest oddity so far. Eldrown does not only preserve what was added, it preserves what was removed. The forms left by draining are as important as the forms left by filling. The rock records both presence and departure. Here, on this muted line under cloud and moss, the plain begins to hint that its real structure may extend beneath the visible surface, into cavities and roots made by vanished heat. If you kneel beside a depression like this, the plain begins to show a different kind of honesty. What looked from above like a simple dip in the moss can read up close as the upper trace of a conduit. The floor is uneven, but its unevenness has direction. It narrows, then widens, then bends with a steadiness that feels less like weather and more like transport. That matters because ordinary erosion usually announces itself with debris carried outward, with soil arranged by water, with the familiar sorting of landscapes by gravity and time. Here, the line seems to belong to an older movement. It is not a gully cut into the lava field. It is part of the lava field's own internal design. When a basalt flow cools on the outside, while molten material keeps traveling within, roofs can form over active channels. Those roofs do not appear all at once. They thicken gradually, crust over, harden, and become strong enough to span moving rock beneath them. For a while, the lava field contains both surface and interior, both stillness and circulation. Then the supply changes. The molten core drains onward, or thins, or leaves behind empty space where it once passed. And when that happens, a field of stone can inherit a hidden anatomy. That is the real shift in how Eldrown begins to feel. Not merely like hardened lava spread over open ground, but like the cooled shell of a once-living flow system. The plain has an outside, certainly. Moss grows there, rain falls there, wind moves over it. But inside that outer quiet, there may still be the shapes of tubes, chambers, sagged ceilings, and passages where heat once traveled with purpose. The softness above becomes more interesting because of the emptiness below. A patch of moss here is not just a patch of moss. It might be resting over a void, not a dramatic cavern in every case, and not some endless hidden world, but a small absence, a cooled tunnel, a pocket left by retreating lava, a fracture widened by contraction. Across a field this large, even modest voids change the meaning of the whole surface. They make the land composite, part roof, part crust, part broken shell over older movement. In Iceland, lava tubes are not unusual in the broad volcanic sense. They are a known consequence of fluid basaltic eruptions, especially where lava can travel over long distances without fully cooling. The process is simple enough to picture. The outer layer meets the air and chills. The interior, insulated by that new crust, remains hot and mobile. As long as molten basalt continues to be fed into the channel, the tube stays active. It acts almost like a thermal pipeline, conserving heat and allowing the flow to extend much farther than an exposed stream of lava could manage. When the eruption weakens or the route reorganizes, some tubes empty. What remains is not motion but architecture. That architecture is often hidden, and hidden structure has a special effect on the mind. It makes a place seem deeper than it looks. That is exactly what begins to happen on El Drown. The field is still broad, low, and mostly quiet. Yet now each rise seems to contain a second possibility. A dome may be solid all the way through, or it may be inflated over old cavities. A hollow may be no more than sagged crust, or it may reflect the collapse of a former roof. You cannot see these distinctions everywhere from the surface, but once you know they are possible, the plane never fully flattens again. It gains inwardness. Some of that inwardness comes from cooling itself. Basalt contracts as it loses heat. That contraction can crack the crust. It can produce tension fractures, small separations, and weaknesses that later guide water or frost. Meanwhile, trapped gases and steam may leave pockets or irregular textures inside the rock. And where one pulse of lava overtakes another, or where advancing fronts overlap unevenly, the resulting layers can cool with spaces between them, with rough, rubbly zones, or with narrow pathways left partially open. The field does not have to be dramatic to be complicated. In fact, its calmness makes the complication easier to miss. A more jagged lava landscape might advertise every fracture and cavity. El Drown, softened by moss and distance, lets them sink into the background. That concealment is part of the strangeness. You are standing on a place that has spent centuries becoming visually gentle without becoming structurally simple. The clue returns in sound as much as shape, not a loud sound, not the theatrical hollow ring that imagination might expect, just subtle differences underfoot, where stone, moisture, and buried gaps alter the firmness of the ground. One patch feels dense and settled, another gives back a slightly different resistance, as though the mass below is interrupted. It would be wrong to exaggerate this into mystery. Still, the body notices variation before the mind explains it. And in a landscape built by crust, drainage, and collapse, variation is information. If you continue along the line of the depression, its behavior grows more convincing. It keeps coherence. It does not wander randomly downslope like a trickle of recent rain. It follows a broader inherited logic, sometimes shallow enough to nearly disappear, then returning as a more defined sag between mossy shoulders. The effect is like reading the ghost of a channel, not open now, not active, but remembered in form. This is where the plane stops being a surface you walk on and becomes a surface you interpret. That interpretive turn changes almost everything. A shallow trench might mark a drained pathway. A low arching rise might be inflation, where molten lava accumulated beneath a cooling skin and lifted it slightly. A jumbled dark margin under the moss might be clinker, the broken and rough outer part of a flow front. A wider flat section may once have been a ponded area where basalt paused, thickened, and later crusted over in place. Each feature remains quiet. None demands a dramatic reading. Yet together they transform the field from scenery into preserved process. That is one reason volcanic plains can feel so unlike river plains or glacial plains. Their forms are not only shaped after emplacement, they are also shaped during emplacement, while the material is still moving, cooling, crusting, and reorganizing itself. The land is not simply left there and then modified, it partly composes itself in motion. El Drown is eloquent in that way. Even where the individual clues are small, the cumulative effect is large. Repeated enough times across a broad area, subtle forms become a language. And that language says the plane was built from flow that remained active beneath its own skin. You can follow that thought farther into the hidden spaces. Imagine a tube carrying basalt under a hardened roof. While the eruption continues, the roof is only the top of a conduit. Its support comes from the molten rock moving below. Then, as supply wanes, the level inside the tube falls. Perhaps it drains completely. Perhaps it leaves behind ledges, a partial floor, or puddled remnants. If the roof is strong enough, the empty tube remains. If it is weak, sections fail. The collapse may be local, producing small skylights or sunken strips. Or it may happen in a chain, creating an elongated depression where the roof once spanned a passage. Seen centuries later under moss, such structures lose their rawness. They become smooth enough to look natural in a very general sense, but not ordinary in a specific one. The plane develops this curious quality of being both obvious and elusive. The clues are in front of you, yet they only make sense once you accept that absence can shape land just as surely as accumulation can. That is not unique to lava fields, of course. Caves do something similar in limestone. Melting ice leaves hollows in glacial terrain, but basalt brings its own version. The voids here are not dissolved by water over immense spans. They are left by retreating heat. That gives the whole system a different emotional texture. The hidden interior is not ancient in the same way as a limestone cave. It is born almost immediately from cooling and drainage. The landscape acquires emptiness as part of its first construction. That is very close to the heart of why Eldrown feels unfinished, even after centuries. It was complete enough to harden, incomplete enough to preserve process. The plain never became one simple mass. It remained a layered event. Weather and plant life have settled onto that event since then, but they have not erased it. If anything, they have made it easier to contemplate. A bare tube collapse in fresh black basalt might speak too sharply. A moss-softened sag invites longer looking. The calm lets structure emerge. There are places on basalt plains where snow behaves as a guide to buried form. In winter, thin cover may settle differently above voids, ridges, and moisture pathways. Cold air can pool in hollows. Heat stored in rock can delay freezing on certain exposures. Elsewhere, narrow depressions collect drifts while raised crusted bands stay more exposed to wind. Though the present moment is damp and mostly green, the memory of winter belongs to the field as well. Each season tests the architecture in a different way. Freeze and thaw enter cracks. Water moves into pores and joints. Ice expands where liquid has seeped into hidden spaces. Then spring returns, and the moss resumes its slow work of holding moisture against the rock. What the eruption created as internal structure, the climate continues to read. That continuity is important. It means the hidden world under the moss is not only a relic, it is still active as a framework for modern processes. Water disappears into fractures because the fractures are there. Cold gathers in some hollows because the hollows are there. Vegetation thickens where roughness traps moisture because the roughness is there. The old lava architecture remains in conversation with weather. And once again the field proves that it is not static in the full sense. Still, there is restraint in the way these processes show themselves. No single cavity explains the plain. No single collapse reveals its entire history. The key is distributed evidence. A sag here, a ridge there, a depression holding its course farther than chance would suggest. A faint seam of exposed stone where moss cannot fully smooth the original break. A slight change in vegetation where moisture lingers in a hidden crack system. The more of these details you gather, the less abstract the inner landscape becomes. At some point, the idea of a hollow plain stops being metaphor. It becomes the most practical reading of the terrain. This is the midpoint in understanding. Earlier, the field looked strange because it preserved motion. Now it looks stranger because that motion did not only shape the visible surface, it also built an unseen underside of roots and gaps. The plain is a shell in places, a drained body in places, a cooled network, not just a cooled blanket. And from here, every step has to account for that. You begin to notice how many of the swells resemble frozen overflows, and how many of the hollows seem less excavated than inherited. You notice that some lines continue where ordinary erosion would likely have blurred them more. You notice that the field's repetitions are not repetitions of one object, but of one process recurring over and over. Flow, crust, drain, sag, fracture, settle. That sequence, repeated at different scales, gives Eldrown its peculiar consistency. The plain feels unified because it was shaped by a relatively coherent style of lava behavior. But it also feels intricate because that behavior produced many local variations. A tube here, a lobe there, a collapse farther on, an inflated sheet beyond that. Sameness and complexity arrive together. That pairing is part of the quiet fascination of basalt landscapes. They can look simple from afar and become more articulate the longer you remain among them. The mind adjusts slowly. At first it sees only green over black stone. Then it sees a lava field. Then it sees a lava field preserving movement. Then it sees a hollow lava field where the true form includes spaces no longer occupied by what made them. Each layer of understanding does not replace the previous one, it deepens it. And because the plain never shouts its structure, the deepening feels calm, almost intimate, as though the landscape is not being decoded so much as listened to. It helps to think about the eruption in terms of supply rather than spectacle. Molten basalt emerged from a fissure system and moved outward across existing land. Where the slope allowed, it advanced. Where the rate of eruption stayed high enough, it fed channels continuously. Where crust formed early, that crust insulated the interior. The field could therefore become more efficient at transporting heat as it expanded. This is one of the paradoxes of fluid basalt. By cooling on the outside, it sometimes preserves the ability to travel farther inside. The skin helps the core remain mobile. The consequence is a longer reach, a larger plain, and a stronger possibility of internal voids after drainage. So the hidden spaces are not an afterthought. They are a natural outcome of the very mechanism that made Eldran broad. If the lava had been thicker and less mobile, the landscape might have piled up more steeply near its source. It might have produced short, rugged fronts and prominent accumulations. Instead, because the basalt was fluid, the eruption built distance. Distance required transport. Transport favored channels, crusted pathways, and in some places roofed systems. Those systems later became emptiness, and emptiness became topography. That chain of cause and effect is unusually satisfying here because it remains visible. Not visible in every detail, certainly, but visible enough that the plain can still be read as a sequence of physical decisions made by lava itself. How far can I go? Where does the crust form first? What happens if the interior keeps moving? What remains when the feed declines? Of course, the lava made no conscious choice, yet the ground preserves its behavior so coherently that the resulting landscape feels almost intentional. Another low sag opens beside the path of attention. This one is wider, less clearly linear, more like a settled basin between pressure ridges. The moss in it is thicker. Dampness lingers longer here. Tiny plants gather where shelter and moisture combine. This, too, is part of the hidden architecture. Once a lava field contains relief, however modest, it begins to organize the future. Depressions trap organic matter. Raised zones shed water more quickly. Cracks collect fine sediment blown or washed into them. On fresh basalt, life does not arrive evenly. It follows structure. The field's volcanic texture becomes ecological instruction. That means the hollow world under the moss affects not only geology, but biology. A collapsed channel may guide meltwater in spring. A fracture may hold enough moisture for moss to thicken. A rough clinkery margin may create shaded pockets for lichens. A stable inflated slab may dry faster and support a different pattern of growth. The ecosystem remains sparse compared with richer soils elsewhere, yet even sparseness has pattern. The plain does not host life randomly. It hosts life according to the opportunities created by cooling lava. This is why the moss cover, though soft and visually unifying, should not be mistaken for a simple blanket laid over the whole field. It is responsive. It varies with microtopography, moisture retention, exposure, and the chemistry of the substrate. Basalt weathers differently from many other rocks. Fresh volcanic glass and mineral surfaces are initially harsh places for plants. They offer little soil, little stored organic matter, and a rough physical environment. But they also fracture, hold water in textures and pores, and gradually release minerals through weathering. Over time, that makes them surprisingly open to colonization. Not quickly, not evenly, but persistently. The transition from black to green is therefore not cosmetic. It is a slow biological reading of the lava field's physical form. In that sense, the moss does not hide the structure, it translates it. A ridge becomes a long green back. A collapse becomes a moist, dim basin. A fracture becomes a darker seam with thicker growth. The hidden world below shapes the living surface above. The plain can seem almost tender because the colonizers are small. Moss, lichens, scattered vascular plants, thin soils gathering grain by grain. Nothing rushes. Nothing overwhelms the stone. Instead, life settles into the spaces made available to it. This gentleness is one reason landscapes like Eldrown can feel emotionally complex. They were born in extraordinary heat, yet they are now best understood through patience. The violence is real in history, the present expression is softness. The rock remains rough beneath, the cover remains delicate above, neither cancels the other. To stay with the hidden architecture a little longer, it helps to notice that not every void needs to be large to matter. A narrow crack can redirect water. A shallow cavity can preserve frost longer into the day. A rubbly layer beneath a crust can make drainage quicker in one spot than another. At landscape scale, thousands of minor internal differences produce visible outcomes. That is another source of Eldrown's strangeness. It is not strange only because of a few notable features. It is strange because innumerable small structural details inherited from flow and cooling continue to influence the field as a whole. This distributed complexity resists quick summary. You cannot point to one grand lava tube and say, there is the meaning of the plain. The meaning is everywhere. It is in the way hollows repeat. It is in the way raised lobes hold together as a pattern. It is in the way water vanishes from one place and supports green thickness in another. It is in the sense that the field has more interior than its low profile should permit. That last feeling is perhaps the most distinctive. Low landscapes are often assumed to be simple. Mountains imply hidden structure more readily. Cliffs promise depth. A broad, mossy plain seems at first glance to offer only horizontal rest. Eldrown quietly overturns that expectation. Its depth is not vertical spectacle. It is concealed construction. The field stores complexity beneath modest contours. And because of that, the eye keeps returning, trying to reconcile what looks soft and open with what must be fractured, layered, and partly hollow below. At a certain point, the depression being followed thins into ambiguity. It no longer commands the view. It dissolves into the repeating rise and fall of the plain, but the understanding it offered does not fade with it. Now the whole field seems full of candidate routes and buried continuities. One line disappears into moss, another begins beyond it, a third curves away along the side of a low dome. Some will be true remnants of flow pathways. Some may be later modifications, helped by water and frost. Most likely, many features record several histories at once. That, too, belongs to mature volcanic terrain. The original structure is not erased by later weathering. It is inhabited by it. The drained channels become damp corridors, the fractures become water paths, the collapses become sediment traps. The lava plain acquires age by allowing new processes to enter old forms. This is the moment when the section underfoot stops being only volcanic geology and begins to open into landscape ecology. Because once voids, ridges, and porous rock interact with rain, snow, wind, and frost, they start to generate niches, and niches are the beginnings of pattern in living systems. The first colonizers of bare lava are often lichens and mosses, organisms able to tolerate nutrient-poor conditions and cling to rough substrates. Lichens, those slow composites of fungus and photosynthetic partners, can attach directly to mineral surfaces. They begin the long work of biological weathering. They trap dust. They contribute tiny amounts of organic matter as they grow and die. Mosses follow where moisture lingers and texture allows anchoring. Their cushions hold water astonishingly well. They moderate temperature at the rock surface. They create soft microhabitats on what would otherwise remain harsh stone. Over long periods, such modest occupations matter enormously. They are how a lava field begins to turn into something greener without ceasing to be lava. In Iceland's cool maritime climate, that transformation has a particular style. Temperatures are not tropical, growth is not lush in the ordinary sense. Instead, dampness, cloud cover, and frequent moisture support steady but slow colonization. That means weathering here is less a sudden greening than a long, quiet negotiation between stone, water, and very small living things. Each damp spell gives the moss another chance to hold. Each winter loosens a little more mineral surface. Each summer, brief and cool, lets tiny tissues grow across black rock by fractions almost too small to imagine. Over centuries, those fractions accumulate. What had been a crust becomes a habitat. What had been abrasive becomes, in places, almost soft to the touch. Yet the softness is never deep in the ordinary agricultural sense. There is not a thick old soil here, settled and generous, hiding the rock completely below. There is a skin. There are cushions. There are thin pockets of gathered material, trapped in cracks and hollows where wind-blown dust, decaying moss, and mineral grains have had time to rest together. That is why Eldron seems so strange under changing light. It is green, but not in the way a meadow is green. Its living cover is more like a veil over a recent geologic sentence that has not finished being legible. If you look closely at a patch of moss stretched over uneven lava, you can see that it does not grow with equal thickness everywhere. On exposed bumps, it may be shorter, tighter, more weathered by wind. In sheltered dimples, it thickens, holding moisture longer after rain. Along narrow seams where the rock has fractured, the green may darken because water lingers there just a little more faithfully. This is a subtle thing, but it matters. The biological pattern is reading the volcanic pattern. Life is not arriving here and imposing a new geometry. It is responding to the geometry that lava left behind. The plain, in that sense, is still instructing what can happen on its surface. A rough clinker zone offers one kind of foothold. A smooth, inflated crust offers another. A drained trough, with fine sediment collecting in it over decades, becomes a corridor of slightly thicker growth. A collapsed hollow may remain cooler, wetter, and more sheltered than the rise beside it. So, the green cover is not a blanket spread evenly over stone. It is a map of opportunity. And because those opportunities were created by flowing basalt, the ecosystem retains a direct memory of fire without needing any flame. This slow ecological settling changes the emotional quality of the plain. At first, Eldram can seem uncanny because it preserves movement. Then it becomes stranger because it is partly hollow. Now it acquires another layer: tenderness. not softness in the sentimental sense, but a kind of patient repair. The land is not recovering in order to become what it was before. That older surface is gone. What it is doing instead is learning how to be inhabited in the form the eruption gave it. That distinction is important. Volcanic landscapes are sometimes described as if life eventually conquers them, covering their rawness and restoring normality. But Eldrown does not really support that story. It has not been restored to a previous plane. It has become a new plane, one whose living surface depends on the wrinkles, voids, and fragments of basalt beneath it. The moss does not cancel the lava. It interprets it. That interpretation is slow enough that the mind can almost feel time-changing scale. The eruption itself was fierce and comparatively brief. The greening has taken centuries. One mode of landscape making happened in months. The other has unfolded through countless cycles of rain, frost, dim light, and very slight growth. When you stand in the middle of Eldrown, those two tempos exist together. The folds of the lava remember speed. The moss remembers patience. Neither one can be understood properly without the other. This is where the plane begins to feel less like an accident of geology and more like a layered text. The first writing was molten. The second was climatic. The third is biological. All three remain visible at once. In the lower swales, where moisture is retained just a little longer, there may be thicker moss and more varied small plants. On higher, wind-struck rises, the cover can be thinner and the stone's influence more obvious. Lichens may occupy surfaces that seem almost impossible at first glance because their requirements are modest and their pace is so long that urgency never enters the picture. They do not need richness. They need persistence. And persistence here is abundant. The air is often damp, the temperatures are moderate, the light, though sometimes thin, returns season after season. There is enough for small life to continue its almost invisible work. Basalt itself helps shape that process in several ways. It is dark, so it can absorb heat when sunlight appears, even briefly. It is fractured and porous, so water can enter and be held in textures and cracks. As it slowly weathers, minerals become available to the earliest colonizers. Not all at once, and not in deep reserves, but enough to matter over long periods. Fresh volcanic rock is austere, weathered basalt is still austere, but increasingly conversational. It gives a little... The living world answers. This is one reason the moss cover in Icelandic lava fields can seem so unusually complete, even over rough terrain. The very unevenness of the lava creates innumerable microsites. Every crevice is a place where dust might collect. Every sheltered notch is a place where evaporation may slow. Every broken edge casts a little shadow. And in a cool climate, even a small reduction in exposure can matter. A landscape that appears monotonous from a distance may therefore be full of ecological distinctions at close range. That is another form of strangeness in Eldrown. Repetition on the scale of the eye coexists with diversity on the scale of the hand. The plane keeps asking you to shift between distances. From far away, it seems like one continuous mossy field. Up close, it is a mosaic of surfaces, moisture levels, textures, and tiny successes of growth. And that mosaic traces back again and again to the behavior of lava when it cooled. There is also the matter of fragility. Moss can make a lava field look durable in a familiar pastoral way, as though it has settled into a stable and forgiving ground. But much of this softness is delicate. Moss accumulates slowly. A footprint in the wrong place can remain visible for years. That fact introduces a gentle tension. The plane looks resilient because it has endured wind, frost, and centuries of weather. Yet its living skin is vulnerable because it has formed so gradually and under such sparse conditions. Strangeness here includes slowness. The ecosystem is not weak in spirit. It is simply operating on a timescale that makes ordinary disturbance feel loud. This matters because it reveals how thin the translation from lava to landscape still is. Elsewhere, Older volcanic terrains have passed so thoroughly into soil, forest, or grassland that the original flow texture becomes secondary. Here, the translation remains incomplete enough that a damage to the surface can expose the youth beneath. You are never very far from stone. Even in the greenest patches, the underlying architecture feels close. That closeness gives Eldron its double identity. It is an ecosystem, yes. It is also a geologic event resting just under the ecosystem's breath. A shallow depression filled with thicker moss offers a clear example. At a glance, it is simply a softer place in the field, but if you follow the logic inward, several things may be happening at once. The depression may have begun as a sag and cooling crust. Its shape may have helped collect fine material over time. That fine material may hold moisture more efficiently than bare rock. The extra moisture may support denser moss. The denser moss may then trap more organic matter and retain yet more water. A small initial irregularity in lava becomes, over centuries, a modest ecological advantage. Cause and effect stack quietly. This is how raw volcanic relief becomes biological pattern without ever losing its origin. The same is true of ridges. A pressure ridge raised during the final movement of a flow may stand only slightly above the surrounding surface. Yet that slight elevation can increase wind exposure and drainage. The moss there may remain shorter, thinner, or lighter. The ridge can persist as a visible line not because it is high, but because climate and vegetation continue to honor the shape lava gave it. The land remembers itself through growth. Nothing dramatic is required, just repetition over enough seasons. And this process of translation is still going on. That may be the most quietly remarkable part. Eldron is not a finished museum piece. It is still changing. Not rapidly, not in the way that would trouble the eye from one year to the next. But in the geological and ecological sense, the field is still in conversation with weather, with moisture, with living colonizers, and with the chemistry of its own rock. A new crack opened by frost, a thin soil deepening in one hollow, a patch of lichen spreading across a newly favorable surface, a moss cushion dying back in an exposed place and thickening in another. The plain's broad form is old enough now to feel established. Its fine details remain active. That continuing change softens the idea of aftermath. After a great eruption, it is tempting to imagine a simple sequence: fire, then cooling, then stillness. But stillness here contains process. The visible motion is gone, the shaping continues. Weathering is a form of writing, so is growth. So is water finding the interior routes left by the original flow. And because those later processes are gentler than the first, they make the whole plain feel contemplative rather than violent. It is possible to stand here and feel not the memory of catastrophe, but the presence of patience. Even the color helps. Black basalt under cloud can be severe. Black basalt under moss becomes something else. The green is muted, almost grey at times in Icelandic light, and because of that, it doesn't overpower the stone. It softens it without disguising it. There are moments, especially under low overcast, when the plain seems to glow from within very faintly, not with brightness, but with subdued saturation. Dark green over dark rock, all of it held under pale sky. The effect is calming, but it also sharpens the central question: why does this place feel so unlike an ordinary field? By now the answer has several parts. Because it spread rather than grew upward. Because it cooled while still moving underneath. Because it retains hollows and routes formed by draining lava. Because weather and life have settled over those forms without erasing them. And because the surface, though increasingly alive, remains thin enough to let the volcanic body show through. The longer you remain with these causes, the more the plain resists simplification. It is neither barren nor lush, neither raw nor fully mellowed, neither solid in the simple sense, nor open in the obvious sense. It occupies an in-between condition with unusual confidence, and perhaps that is why it settles so deeply in the mind. Many landscapes feel legible right away. A valley explains itself by its river, a mountain explains itself by height. A coastal plain explains itself by open deposition and sea near flatness. Eldron keeps delaying explanation. Every answer reveals another layer. It is a field, yes, but not one shaped first by soil. It is volcanic, yes, but not obviously dramatic in profile. It is green, yes, but not because geology has faded into the background. The place remains legible only if you hold several tempos and several materials in mind at once. Basalt, frost, rain, moss, hollows, airflow, thin soil, and time. As that understanding settles, another subtle difference begins to emerge. The plain does not only shape the plants that grow on it, it also shapes the air just above it. A lava field has a way of making its own near-ground atmosphere. Its dark surfaces absorb what sunlight there is. Its hollows hold cold. Its fractures take in water that may vanish from sight and alter nearby dampness later. Its roughness slows wind close to the ground in some places and channels it in others. If a meadow is one kind of climate at foot level, a moss-covered basalt field is another. That shift is easy to miss because it happens so low, so quietly, and over short distances. But once noticed, it changes the sense of the entire region. A slight fog may linger in one trough longer than on the rise beside it. Snow, in colder months, may melt early on a dark exposed hump, while persisting in a sheltered hollow. Rainfall may disappear almost immediately into cracks in one area, while in another it collects long enough to sustain denser growth. The plain is not merely receiving the weather, it is reorganizing it. That reorganization begins with porosity. Basaltic lava fields often contain abundant spaces for water to enter, from visible cracks and drained channels to tiny pores and broken rubbly layers between crusted surfaces. On Eldron, that means rain and meltwater do not always behave in the way they would on compact soil. Water can vanish, not as magic, but as infiltration. It moves downward into fractures and voids, into the rough internal architecture left by cooling and drainage. From above, this can make the landscape feel oddly elusive. Moisture is present. The moss proves that. The air proves that. Yet surface water does not always remain where expected. The field swallows it, then reveals its effects elsewhere. This gives the plain an internal hydrology, not a river network in the open sense, but a distributed set of pathways shaped by volcanic structure. Some water passes quickly through upper layers of broken basalt. Some is held in moss and shallow organic pockets near the surface. Some emerges later at edges, lower zones, springs, or wetlands near the lava field's margins. That means the true movement of water through Eldron is partly hidden, just as the movement of lava once was. The analogy is quiet but profound. First the fire moved beneath crust. Now water moves through what that crust became. The architecture has changed purpose without losing continuity. Following moisture rather than topography becomes the next way of reading the plain. A shallow dip with unusually vivid moss may indicate a place where seepage lingers. A line of slightly greener vegetation beyond the main field may mark an outlet where infiltrated water returns. A patch of ground that dries faster than its neighbors may be underlain by especially open or broken basalt. None of these clues shouts, but together they reveal that Eldron is not a sealed surface. It breathes water. That capacity affects temperature as well. Dark lava can warm quickly when sun appears, even under cool air. At night, or under clear, cold conditions, the same rough rock may lose heat efficiently. Cold air tends to settle in hollows. Sheltered cavities can preserve chill. Moss cushions insulate the immediate surface, moderating some fluctuations while holding moisture against stone. The result is a patchwork of microclimates. The differences are small, often only a matter of degrees, exposure, and timing. Yet for mosses, lichens, small plants, invertebrates, and microbial life, such differences are decisive. A centimeter of shelter matters. A little retained dampness matters. A hollow that stays cool and wet slightly longer matters. So the lava field behaves not just as landform, but as climate machine at miniature scale. And because these microclimates are tied to volcanic structure, the ecosystem remains inseparable from geology. This is where the plain widens conceptually. Until now, it has been possible to think of Eldron as a lava event later softened by life. But once water and air enter the story, the field becomes a system. The eruption provided form. The form redistributed moisture, moisture guided colonization, vegetation altered retention and insulation. Seasonal cold and thaw then deepened some cracks, protected some pockets, and reshaped the pattern further. Everything loops gently back into everything else. That is why the plain feels so complete in its strangeness. Its oddness is not in one feature, it is in the way many modest processes fit together. Even sound belongs to this. Open grassland has one kind of acoustic softness. A lava field has another. The rough, broken texture interrupts movement near the ground. Moss absorbs. Hollows contain and dampen. Wind passes over low ridges and loses some of its long, unbroken sweep. The result is often a hush that feels thicker than the scale of the terrain would suggest. Not silence exactly, more like subdued contact between air and surface. The land does not ring, it receives. In wet weather, that quality deepens. Rain on grass can be a patter. Rain on moss and porous lava is often quieter, more quickly absorbed, less inclined to announce itself with prolonged runoff. Water enters rather than skims. A place that takes in moisture this readily can feel psychologically different from one that sheds it. There is less insistence on the surface, more suggestion of an interior. Again, the plain seems deeper than it looks. Winter reveals this hidden logic in especially clear ways. When snow arrives, it does not create one uniform white field. Dark ridges may remain visible where wind strips the cover thin. Shallow hollows may gather drifts. Mild warmth retained by exposed rock can delay accumulation in some places and accelerate melt in others. Infiltration beneath snow cover can alter freezing patterns from below. And because the lava field is rough at small scales, the snow settles into that roughness, outlining features that summer moss smooths from immediate notice. A drained channel may become a line of shadow under thin white cover. A pressure ridge may read as a long, low back beneath the snow. The plain writes itself again, season by season, in different materials. Spring adds another version. Meltwater enters where it can. Some disappears quickly into cracks and porous layers. Some lingers in depressions and along edges where fine sediment has gathered. Growth resumes first where water and shelter are best matched. A slight flush of greener tone may spread through one corridor, while nearby rises remain subdued. It is not a flamboyant spring, it is a precise one. The lava field decides where abundance, however modest, can begin. This is one reason nearby wetlands and small vegetated zones can owe more to the lava plain than they appear to at first glance. Water that sinks into basalt upslope may re-emerge lower down where the rock becomes less permeable, where topography forces it outward, or where a buried route reaches daylight. Thus the plain is not isolated from its surroundings. It helps organize them. A lava field can feed springs. It can shape marshy patches at its margins. It can redirect surface flow into subsurface pathways, only for that water to return in a different place and support a greener line through the broader landscape. So Eldron is not simply a static remnant of eruption laid across older country, it is an active mediator between volcanic structure and present ecology. That mediation is one of the least immediately obvious and most important reasons it feels so unusual. The eye first sees moss over lava. With more time, the eye begins to see lava directing water, water directing plants, and plants altering the feel of the air itself. Even temperature underfoot can vary enough to be noticed in certain conditions. A dark exposed stone warmed by a brief break in cloud, a damp moss hollow still cool from the morning, a sheltered depression where cold lingers, a porous zone where evaporation leaves the surface subtly chilled. These are not large dramatic sensations, they are local and shifting. But such local shifts are exactly how a small climate becomes tangible. The plain contains weather in miniature. There is also the matter of fog. In southern Iceland, low cloud and ground-hugging mist are never far from possibility. Over Eldrown, fog can settle in a way that changes perception even more than elsewhere, because the repeated relief already confuses distance. A shallow veil of mist may fill the troughs while leaving the domed moss rises visible. Or it may slide over the whole field evenly, removing the horizon and making near and far almost impossible to distinguish. The dark lava beneath, the cool, damp air above, and the slight differences in retained heat and moisture all contribute to the feeling that the plain has a low atmospheric life of its own. It does not create weather independently, of course, but it does shape the way weather is felt. That distinction becomes more important the longer you stay close to the ground. A broad valley may have one forecast. A lava field can hold 100 quieter variations inside it. That is part of what makes Eldron seem subtly separate from the land around it. It is not only a plain made of basalt, it is a plain that continues to sort air, cold, dampness, and light according to forms created by flowing rock. Once that becomes clear, the eye begins to follow not just ridges or hollows, but responses. You notice where the moss changes shade. You notice where a shallow dip remains darker after rain. You notice where a line of greener growth extends beyond the main field, as though water has passed invisibly through stone and returned elsewhere. Those are small observations. Taken together, they widen the scale of the story. The lava did not simply stop and become background. It kept influencing what could happen here. Rain falls. Basalt receives it differently from soil. The water enters cracks, voids rubbly layers, and porous surfaces. Some is held, some moves on. Some disappears from sight so quickly that the field can seem drier than it really is. Then, lower down, perhaps beyond the immediate rise, moisture reappears in a spring line, a marshy patch, or a streak of thicker vegetation. Cause and effect remain patient but precise. The eruption made the structure reshaped the movement of water. The water reshaped the living skin. And the living skin altered the near-ground climate again by holding moisture, softening temperature shifts, and slowing evaporation in places where it could thicken. This is why the plain feels difficult to summarize. It is not just volcanic topography, it is a long chain of physical consequences still working. In some seasons, that chain becomes easier to read. After sustained rain, for example, one part of the field may seem almost luminous with damp green, while another remains comparatively muted. That difference is not random. It often reflects tiny inequalities in exposure, relief, and drainage inherited from the original flow. A shallow basin may hold enough fine sediment and retained water to support richer moss. A slightly raised crust may shed moisture just fast enough to stay thinner. A fracture may guide seepage along a hidden line. The plain teaches the same lesson repeatedly. Small forms matter. On ordinary cultivated ground, subtle differences are often leveled by deep soil, repeated disturbance, and the smoothing habits of human use. Here, the opposite has happened. The field has remained rough enough, raw enough, and thinly covered enough that its first structure still governs later pattern. Even where the moss appears continuous, it is listening to the rock. And because of that, Eldron develops a strange integrity. It does not feel like separate layers stacked one above the other. It feels like one thing, changing medium. First heat, then stone, then moisture, then life. The same shape passing through different states. That continuity becomes clearer if you imagine the field in a year of snow. The white cover settles into the low architecture instead of erasing it. Domed rises become smoother. Narrow troughs hold shadow. Wind strips one exposed back while another hollow keeps its drift longer. Then thaw begins unevenly. Dark basalt emerges early in some places, gathering what weak sunlight there is. Elsewhere, meltwater slips into the ground before it can become open runoff. The result is not just seasonal variety. It is further proof that the lava plain has an internal logic. Snow reads it, water reads it, moss reads it, fog reads it. Over centuries, every passing season has in some way traced the same old forms, and that repeated tracing gives the field a kind of low permanence. Not permanence because nothing changes, permanence because change keeps happening along inherited lines. Even sound obeys them. If you imagine wind crossing a smooth open meadow, the motion feels broad and continuous. Across Eldrown, that same wind is interrupted by low ridges, broken stone beneath moss, and countless tiny changes in surface texture. The result is softer, less sweeping, and somehow closer. Air does not simply pass over this plain, it catches, it loosens, it settles in hollows, it skims exposed crests. It quiets in damp places. That contributes to the sensation that Eldron is not entirely open, even though it stretches far. It contains itself. The field has breadth, but it also has inwardness. That inwardness matters when distance starts to become difficult. At first, the repeating domes of moss and dark seams in between seem easy to understand. Then, after enough time among them, they begin to do something more subtle. They flatten the ordinary cues by which distance is measured. A rise nearby looks like a rise farther away. A trough ahead echoes one already passed. A line in the moss suggests direction, but only briefly, before another similar line appears elsewhere. The landscape is not confusing in a dramatic sense. It is confusing by repetition, and repetition has a peculiar effect on the mind. It quiets the urge to locate one dominant feature. It replaces singular landmarks with pattern. That can feel soothing. It can also make the plain seem much larger than it first appears. This is the next strangeness to emerge. Eldrown is vast in a way that is not immediately theatrical. It does not rely on cliffs, height, or violent scale. Instead, it accumulates immensity through sameness. The more similar forms repeat, the less certain the eye becomes about where one unit ends and the next begins. A small undulation ceases to be an isolated mound. It becomes part of a field of related forms extending beyond easy count. Distance stretches because the pattern stretches, and when pattern stretches without clear interruption, the mind has trouble containing it. This is why lava plains often feel larger while walking than they look on a map. On paper, their boundaries can be drawn. On the ground, their repeated surfaces resist quick emotional measurement. A kilometer can feel less like a line crossed and more like a texture continued. That effect is unusually strong here because the moss softens contrast instead of sharpening it. If the basalt were all bare, the eye might catch more abrupt edges and sharper local drama. But the green cover rounds so much of the surface that the major geometry becomes low, broad, and persistent. Each rise resembles a slowed wave. Each trough resembles a pause between waves. The whole field begins to look less like landforms arranged on top of a surface and more like one surface folded over and over. And folded surfaces are hard to reduce. This makes orientation a different kind of experience. You are not lost in the usual sense. The sky remains open, the land is low, the horizon, when clear, still exists. Yet the plain withholds easy emotional anchors. There may be no tree, no cliff, no single outcrop, no dramatic peak within the field itself to gather attention and organize space. Instead, there is structure by recurrence, one dark seam after another, one moss dome after another, one shallow depression after another. The eye starts to relax its search for the exceptional. It begins to read the plain as rhythm. That rhythm is central to the place. Because Eldron was made by repeated pulses of lava spreading outward, crusting, pressing, overlapping, and settling. Repetition is not superficial. It is the memory of process written at large scale. What feels monotonous from one angle becomes intricate from another. Aerial views make this easier to appreciate conceptually. From above, the lava field is not one uniform carpet. It is a network of flow lobes, pressure zones, channels and surface textures interlocking across a broad area. Some parts are smoother sheets, some parts are rougher and more broken. Some arc around older obstacles or follow pre-existing low ground. Others stack subtly against neighboring pulses. The apparent sameness is therefore real only at one level of attention. At another level, the plane is remarkably specific. It is a composite of many related acts of movement. That revelation matters because it resolves a quiet tension. The field seems simple. The field is not simple. It seems repetitive. The repetition contains information. Once you understand that, the plane becomes harder to dismiss as merely empty space between more dramatic Icelandic landscapes. It is not absence of scenery. It is a different kind of scenery, one built from subtle forms, repeating often enough to become their own vastness. And the more the repetition persists, the more the mind begins to experience scale emotionally rather than geometrically. You may know roughly how large the lava field is, but the body registers something else. It registers continuation. It registers the low refusal of the land to resolve into a single view. That is why the plain can feel almost oceanic, not because it resembles water in color or movement now, but because it repeats surface texture to the point that near and far begin to blur into one extended condition. A calm sea can do that. A lava plain can do it too. Here, the comparison feels especially apt because the original basalt once behaved in a fluid way. The stone still lies with the posture of spreading. That posture survives even after greening. Under certain light, the resemblance deepens. When cloud lowers and the illumination becomes diffuse, shadows retreat. Without strong directional light, the relief flattens. The moss domes become soft swells. The hollows become dim troughs. Distance loses edge. The field can look less like a series of objects and more like a single dark surface breathing very slowly. Then, if the cloud lifts and light comes at an angle, the hidden detail returns. Pressure ridges sharpen. Low scarps of broken basalt darken. Collapsed traces become legible again. The same landscape alternates between broad calm and intricate evidence, depending on how the light chooses to move across it. This changing legibility is another reason Eldrown resists easy understanding. It does not present its full structure all at once. Sometimes it offers scale, sometimes texture, sometimes atmosphere, sometimes process, rarely all together. So the playing teaches patience by withholding summary. A closer look reveals how repetition and complexity coexist in the flow units themselves. What seems from a distance like one long undulating surface may actually be composed of adjacent lobes. Each lobe was once a front of advancing basalt. It spread until cooling slowed it, then fresh supply from behind thickened, pushed, or overtopped parts of it. The edge may have broken into rough clinker, the top may have inflated. The interior may have drained. Later pulses arrived alongside or around it. Over time, the whole field became a mesh of these interactions. That means the apparent monotony of Eldron is not the monotony of one event repeated thoughtlessly. It is the monotony of one behavior recurring in slightly different ways across a large area. And that is much more interesting. The field is not repetitive because nothing happened. It is repetitive because the same physical rules kept producing related forms. Fluid basalt moved outward, cooling crust formed, pressure built, margins broke, pathways drained, weather entered, moss settled. Repeat that enough times, with local variation, and a lava plain emerges that feels both unified and inexhaustible. The eye begins to test this idea by searching for exceptions. A slightly higher rise, a wider trough, a rougher patch where exposed stone interrupts the green, a smoother dome that suggests inflation beneath crust. These differences are real, but they do not break the field's coherence. Instead, they confirm it. The plain contains local departures within a consistent grammar. A language becomes recognizable not because every sentence is identical, but because variation occurs inside shared rules. Eldrown behaves that way. That is why it remains legible even while it stretches. This larger understanding naturally leads beyond the lava field itself. If the plain seems strange because of how it formed, then another question follows quietly. Why is a place like this here at all? Why does Iceland produce not only volcanoes, but broad basalt landscapes that can still feel geologically recent under moss and cloud? The answer lies deeper than Eldrown, beneath the field, beneath the soils around it, beneath even the visible mountains beyond. Iceland exists in a rare geological position. It sits across the mid-Atlantic ridge, where the crust of the Earth is being pulled apart very slowly by plate motion. At the same time, it is influenced by a mantle plume, a persistent upwelling of unusually hot material from deeper within the planet. The combination matters. A spreading ridge alone can produce volcanic activity. A mantle plume alone can produce volcanic islands or plateaus. Together, beneath Iceland, they create extraordinary capacity for melt generation and repeated surface eruption. This is the wider frame in which Eldrown belongs. The lava plain is local, its conditions are planetary. The crust under Iceland is in the long process of being made and remade. That statement can sound dramatic if rushed, but on the scale of this landscape, it is almost serene. Two plates move apart by centimeters each year. Magma rises where pressure conditions and heat allow. Some intrusions stall underground, some feed fissures, some build central volcanoes. Some spread basalt across open country. Over time, the island remains what it has long been, a place where new ground is normal. That is one of the deepest reasons Eldrown feels unfinished. It sits in a land that is itself still being assembled. Most landscapes invite you to think in terms of erosion, of things being worn down from older, more complete forms. Iceland asks for another thought as well. It asks you to consider construction still underway. Rifts open, basalt arrives, steam systems alter rock from below, glaciers carve what volcanism builds. Rivers sort fresh sediment from mountains that did not exist long ago in geological terms. The whole island carries the mood of active making. Eldrown expresses that mood in one particularly quiet way. Instead of a steep cone or explosive crater, it presents a horizontal outcome of crustal process. It says that new land need not rise dramatically to feel uncanny. Sometimes it only needs to spread. The Laki fissure itself belongs to a volcanic system aligned with this tectonic setting. Long fractures can open in Iceland because the crust is under extension. Magna exploits weakness. It intrudes into fissures. Where it reaches the surface, eruptions may occur not from one summit alone, but along elongated cracks. This tends to favor linear volcanic landscapes, rows of craters, distributed sources rather than one singular peak. That geometry leaves a distinct signature on the land. A cone-centered eruption concentrates attention. A fissure eruption distributes it. The resulting landscape is therefore more lateral, more spread out, and often more difficult to emotionally contain. Eldrown inherits that quality. It is part of a rift story, not just an eruption story. If you step back far enough in thought, the plain becomes one visible page in a much larger geological manuscript. Below Iceland, mantle heat helps generate magma. Within the crust, tectonic stretching opens routes for that magma to move. At the surface, eruptions build layers of lava, ash, and tephra in changing combinations. Later, glaciers and weather shape what was emplaced. Plants slowly colonize. Water finds its pathways. The lava plain underfoot is therefore not an isolated curiosity. It is one expression of a landscape where deep earth and surface climate remain unusually close in conversation. That relationship explains some of Iceland's broader peculiarities. Young basalt everywhere, frequent volcanic systems, wide outwash plains fed by glacial melt, geothermal activity in many regions, landforms that look ancient and fresh at the same time. Eldrown fits into that pattern while keeping its own specific identity. It is strange because it preserves motion under moss. It is also strange because, in Iceland, preserving motion is not an exception. It is almost a regional habit. The island is full of surfaces that still remember how they were made. That memory is stronger here because the plain is so low and so broad. Nothing distracts from the process. A mountain can carry many meanings at once: uplift, accumulation, glaciation, weather. A lava field strips the question back to spread, cooling, and aftermath. It lets you see what happens when the earth makes ground in sheets. And because Iceland continues to host volcanic activity, the story is not wholly in the past. New lava fields can still form elsewhere on the island. Fissures can still open. Basalt can still travel outward and begin the slow transition from heat to ecology. Knowing that changes the emotional quality of Eldron again. The field becomes not only a relic, but an example. What happened here is part of an ongoing capacity in the island itself. This is not ancient volcanism preserved only by accident. It is volcanism consistent with where Iceland is and what Iceland is. That realization enlarges the plain without changing its calm. The mossy swells remain low. The hollows remain quiet. The hidden tubes and porous layers remain beneath. Yet now the field belongs to a deeper continuity. Plate separation, mantle heat, recurring basalt, new crust. The landscape looks local. Its causes reach far below sight. That is perhaps why Eldron keeps evading the category of mere surface. Even when standing entirely in the open, you feel pulled downward conceptually. First, into the hidden voids beneath the moss, then deeper into the crustal setting that made such a field possible. A place can be gentle and still possess tremendous depth. This one does. The broad repetition of the lava plain begins to feel less accidental in that larger frame. If Iceland is a place where basaltic eruptions recur and where wide sheets of lava can be emplaced under favorable conditions, then Eldron is both singular and representative. Singular because no two eruptions, no two climates, no two histories of colonization are identical. Representative because the island repeatedly produces young volcanic surfaces that have not yet been fully translated into older, more familiar landforms. That combination matters. It means Eldron does not feel strange only on its own terms. It also feels like a distilled example of a wider Icelandic truth. Land here often seems caught in the interval between creation and weathering, not unfinished in a defective sense. Unfinished in the honest sense of still revealing process. The repetition of low mossy forms across the field starts to echo that broader reality. You could say the plain is difficult to map emotionally because the island itself resists the settled categories used elsewhere. In older continental interiors, ground often feels finalized. Here, ground often feels recently negotiated. Rift, magma, frost, runoff, colonization, each still visible. This is one reason the plain can seem younger than its softness suggests. The green cover proposes age. The preserved lava posture proposes youth. Both impressions are valid. The result is a landscape that appears older and newer depending on what you attend to. Focus on the moss, and time feels long. Focus on the structure under the moss, and time collapses. The eruption becomes close again. That duality is unusually powerful in low evening light. As the day lowers, the plain often gains a kind of dark breadth that makes individual features less important than the total spread. The moss absorbs brightness, the exposed basalt deepens in tone, hollows gather shadow early, ridges become smoother in silhouette. What had seemed at midday like many local forms now gathers into one large body. And in that body, the original movement of the lava becomes easier to feel than to describe. The field appears to have flowed and then held its breath. That image is not scientific language. Still, it comes close to the experience. Because even after tracing the physics of basalt, the cooling crust, the drained channels, the microclimates and the slow arrival of living cover, there remains something in Eldron that resists full domestication by explanation. Not mystery in the theatrical sense, more like surplus meaning. The landscape contains more feeling than any one account can use up. Part of that surplus comes from hiddenness. A mountain shows much of itself outwardly. A lava plain like this withholds crucial parts below a soft skin. Part comes from scale. The repeated forms make the field feel larger than its modest relief should permit. Part comes from tempo. The eruption belonged to months. The moss belongs to centuries. And the mind standing here has to hold both at once. That is difficult, because human attention likes clean scales. It likes to decide whether a place is sudden or slow, raw or weathered, new or ancient. Eldrown keeps refusing that choice. Its strangeness survives explanation because the plain is always carrying more than one age at the same time. The basalt is geologically young. The processes on its surface are old enough to seem patient beyond measure. The climate acts on it every year. The structure under the climate still remembers a particular event. So even after you have read the ridges as pressure, the hollows as drainage, the green skin as patient colonization, and the broad field as part of Iceland's rifted crust, the place remains slightly apart. It still feels less like a completed landscape than like a landscape in a long, calm state of becoming. That is why evening suits it so well. Toward the end of the day, strong distinctions begin to loosen. The sky dims, but not abruptly. The moss darkens first, then the exposed rock catches the last thin light in uneven patches. Then the little hollows between the swells begin to collect shadow until the whole field looks lower, wider, and more connected than it did before. The plain stops presenting features one by one. It becomes a single body again. And once it does, the old comparison to water returns with new force. Not because the lava looks liquid now, because the field still carries the posture of spreading. It lies as if it moved outward and only gradually accepted stillness. Even after centuries, it has not entirely settled into the emotional category of land. This is one of the last important clues. A normal plain usually feels organized by what came after its making, by rivers, by soil, by agriculture, sometimes, by accumulated weathering, by the routines that tell your eye where stability lives. Eldran feels organized first by emplacement. The first act still dominates. Everything since has entered into that act, softened it, translated it, inhabited it, but not displaced it. That gives the place a kind of unusual honesty. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. A field of basalt from a fissure eruption. A field that cooled from the outside inward. A field that partly drained beneath its own crust. A field whose cracks, voids, and roughness then guided water. A field whose moisture patterns invited moss. A field that became green without becoming ordinary. You can gather the whole chain in one view now, if you look slowly enough. Fire spread across low ground, its surface chilled, its interior kept moving. Some pathways emptied, some roofs sagged, some fronts broke into rough margins. Rain entered later. Snow settled unevenly. Frost widened small weaknesses. Moss found the dampest textures. Thin soils formed where particles could rest. The plain learned how to hold life in the shape lava had given it. That is the real answer to the question of why Eldran feels so strange. It is not strange because it is barren. It is not strange because it is extreme. It is strange because almost every part of it is a consequence of something earlier, and those consequences are still visible together. The field is readable all the way through. Not perfectly, not completely, but unusually far. Many landscapes lose their first language under later change. This one still speaks it. Even the places that seem simplest begin to carry extra depth once that is understood. A smooth dome of moss is no longer just a pleasing curve. It may be an inflated section of crust, lifted slightly while lava still pressed below. A dim trough may be the trace of a drained route. A line of richer green may mark a seam where moisture holds longer because the basalt fractured there first. A seemingly gentle rise may conceal sharp clinker under its living cover. Nothing needs to be dramatic for the field to remain compelling. Its quiet is enough. In fact, The quiet is part of what preserves attention. If the lava plain were more spectacular in the ordinary way, the eye might stop at the obvious. Here, because so much is subdued, you keep looking. The low relief asks for patience. The repeated forms ask for comparison. The softness asks you to wonder what lies under it. And the answers, when they come, deepen rather than close the question. This is why people often describe such places in contradictory ways. They call them empty, then intricate. They call them soft, then raw. They call them ancient, then new. All of those descriptions are trying to touch the same fact from different sides. Eldrown occupies an in-between state with unusual coherence. It has enough time on it to feel settled. It has enough preserved structure to feel freshly made. And because those impressions arrive together, the field becomes hard to contain emotionally. You can walk through it and feel soothed. You can study it and feel unsettled in a gentler way, not disturbed. Just reminded that land does not always move from violence to normality in a straight line. Sometimes it moves into a long condition of layered calm, where the original event remains legible under everything that followed. The farther the light falls, the more oceanic the plain becomes. The domes of moss start to resemble a frozen swell pattern. The troughs between them deepen in tone. The exposed stone appears almost wet even when it is dry, simply because dark rock in low light holds shadow differently from soil. It is then that the idea of vastness and hiddenness finally join. By day you can analyze one or the other. By evening they merge. The repeated surface stretches beyond easy count. The structure below remains mostly concealed. What you are left with is a landscape that feels broad on the outside and inward on the inside. That combination is rare. Breadth usually comes with openness. Inwardness usually comes with enclosure. Eldrown somehow has both. It is open to sky and weather. It is also full of withheld depth. That withheld depth is not only geological, it is perceptual. The field never offers all of itself at once. The ridges and hollows reveal only part of the original flow behavior. The moss reveals only part of the substrate. The climate reveals the structure indirectly, through dampness, fog, and uneven snow. Even the scale reveals itself gradually, through repetition rather than spectacle. So the plain teaches a soft kind of humility, not because it is overwhelming in a frightening sense, because it remains partially unread, even after much has been understood. That is not failure of observation. It is simply faithful to the land. Some of the real shape of Eldrown is always under the moss, under the weather, under the low curves that make the field appear gentler than it is. And this hiddenness is exactly what keeps the lava plain from ever quite becoming a normal field in the mind. The softness is genuine, but it is a softness laid over sharpness, over fracture, over void, over cooling history. The green is genuine, but it is a green that depends on black stone remaining close. The calm is genuine, but it is a calm assembled from motions that once traveled very far. This is the point at which explanation and feeling stop competing and begin to assist one another. Knowing the mechanics of basalt does not reduce the wonder. It clarifies it. Knowing about lava tubes and drained channels does not make the field less peaceful. It makes the peace more specific. Knowing about Iceland's rift setting does not make the plain abstract. It places this local stillness inside a deeper, slower making of land. Science here does not strip away atmosphere. It reveals why the atmosphere is so convincing. The plain feels unfinished because, in a precise geological sense, it still carries the shape of its own construction. It feels soft because climate and life have translated that construction without erasing it. It feels vast because repeated forms flatten the usual measures of distance. It feels hidden because part of its truth remains below sight, and all of those reasons support each other. If one were missing, the field would become easier to classify. Because they gather together, Eldrown remains strange. Strange in the best sense, not alien from life, not hostile to the eye, simply resistant to simplification. You can sense this most clearly by stopping the habit of searching for the exceptional. There is no need to find the largest ridge, or the deepest collapse, or the most striking seam of exposed rock. The plain does not depend on singular monuments. Its meaning lives in repetition. One rise, then another. One dim channel trace, then another. One patch where moss thickens in a hollow. One exposed clinker edge under green. One line where moisture has altered the vegetation almost imperceptibly. One broad dark spread lying under pale sky. Again and again, the same physical grammar appears. That repetition is what makes the field feel composed rather than accidental. And because the composition is so low and patient, the whole plain begins to resemble a sentence spoken quietly enough that you have to lean closer to hear it. At this scale of attention, even absence becomes expressive. Places where the moss thins, places where a hollow remains unexplained from the surface alone, places where the contours imply a former pathway but never fully expose it. Eldron is full of these partial disclosures. They matter because they preserve incompletion. The field has been weathered but not flattened, colonized but not covered deeply, readable but not exhausted. That is why its final impression is not closure, it is endurance. The lava plain endures as process turned still and still turning in small ways. A place can be quiet and continue to act. This one still channels moisture. It still holds temperature differences near the ground. It still organizes moss according to the inherited shape of basalt. It still changes by frost, seepage, and minute biological accumulation. Nothing visible hurries. Nothing needs to. The field's calm is active calm. Its stillness contains work. And once you begin to sense that, the plain becomes less like a remnant and more like a living surface with a volcanic memory. There is something deeply Icelandic in that. Not just because Iceland is volcanic, because so much of the island seems to hold first causes close to the surface. Glaciers show their work plainly. Rivers braid across fresh sediment. Steam rises through thin ground elsewhere. Basalt sits under moss without forgetting itself. Land there often appears to have been made recently enough that explanation remains nearby. Eldrown is one of the gentlest examples of that condition. No plume of ash, no glowing fissure, no restless summit, just a dark field gone green, carrying enough of its own birth to remain permanently a little unfamiliar. As the light lowers still further, the plain begins to give back less detail. The microtopography softens first. Then the differences between one dome and the next become harder to separate. The field takes on an almost continuous texture, interrupted only now and then by a seam of darker stone or a trough where shadow gathers early. This visual simplification does something important. It returns you to the oldest truth of the place. Before ridges and hollows were features, before moss was cover, before climate translated the rock into habitat, there was simply outward movement, a broad spread, a dark flooding over land. Even now, in near evening, that original outwardness remains the plain's strongest posture. It is why the field does not feel like accumulated ground. It feels like ground that arrived, and that is a different emotional category entirely. Arrived ground carries its own oddness. It feels less rooted in previous landscape, more laid upon it, more obviously the result of transport and emplacement. Eldron still keeps that quality because the lava surface remains the dominant architecture. If deep soil had developed, if streams had deeply incised it, if forests had obscured its texture, the impression would be different. But the plain remains open enough, young enough, and thinly mantled enough that arrival is still visible. The field has not forgotten that it came from somewhere else along the fissure line, hot and fluid, and spread until the land took the shape of its stopping. That stopping itself was not immediate. Supply changed, crust thickened, interiors drained, margins cooled at different rates, so even the moment of stillness was staggered. Some parts of the field were becoming surface while other parts were still functioning as transport. Some zones had hardened while neighboring roots remained active beneath. That mismatch in timing is still written across the plain. It is why one feature leans into another instead of resolving cleanly. It is why the swells seem less built than arrested. The whole field carries a delayed finish. And delayed finish is one of the deepest forms of strangeness in geology. We tend to imagine landscapes as complete things, but many are really processes left visible. Eldran makes that truth unusually easy to feel. In the broad dimness, the plain also begins to look more level than it truly is. The low ridges withdraw, the shallow basins merge into tone, the eye stops tracing local relief and starts sensing expanse. This is the moment when scale becomes nearly impossible to separate from mood. The field feels larger because it becomes less countable. As long as each rise can be distinguished, distance can be measured in segments. Once the rises blur into one repeating body, measurement gives way to immersion. You are no longer adding forms together. You are inside one condition. That is why the plain's immensity is so quiet. It does not announce size with height. It lets you discover size through loss of distinction. The same is true of age. The field does not announce youth with sharp freshness alone. It lets you discover youth by noticing how directly the eruption still governs everything. That dependence remains strongest near the margins of explanation. For instance, you can say that moss softens the plain, true. But you can also say that the plain dictates where the moss can become thick. Also true. You can say that weather modifies the basalt. True. But you can also say that the basalt reorganizes weather close to the ground. Also true. The cause and effect do not move in only one direction anymore. They loop. The eruption built the form. The form shaped climate at small scales. Climate shaped biology. Biology changed moisture retention and surface insulation. That, in turn, altered further weathering and colonization. The field is no longer simply the product of the eruption. It is the product of the eruption continuing to matter. This is why the plain cannot be thought of as static aftermath. Aftermath suggests a completed event with a passive remainder. Eldran is a remainder, certainly, but not a passive one. It is still organizing what comes to it. Rain, fog, snow, roots, lichens, cold air, thin soil. Everything entering the field gets sorted by a structure made in heat. And because that sorting is quiet, it feels almost meditative rather than mechanical. The plain teaches by small consequences. Water vanishes here. Moss thickens there. A hollow stays colder. A rise dries first. A line of greener life appears beyond the main spread because infiltrated water has returned somewhere less obvious. None of this is loud enough to dominate the place. Yet together, it gives Eldran a profound coherence. It is not strange in fragments. It is strange all the way through. At a certain point, the temptation to explain every form begins to soften as well. Not because there is no explanation, because enough has been seen to allow silence back in. That silence is earned. You have followed the low-pressure ridges. You have traced drained channels in shallow depressions. You have imagined roofed pathways, cavities, and sagged crust beneath the moss. You have watched the green skin turn volcanic roughness into living pattern. You have let moisture, fog, and temperature reveal the plain's small climates. You have placed the whole field within Iceland's spreading crust and mantle-fed volcanism. What remains now is not one more mechanism. It is the plain itself, holding all those mechanisms at once. And in that holding, something changes. The field feels less like an object of study than like a state of matter that settled into landscape and never fully gave up its earlier life. The black stone under the moss is not merely rock in the generic sense. It is motion kept visible. The hollows are not merely low places. They are departures kept visible. The green is not merely growth. It is patience kept visible. This gathering of visible consequences is what makes Eldran so difficult to reduce to a postcard impression. A photograph may catch the moss, it may catch the broad dark spread, it may catch the low Icelandic light, but the plain's deepest quality is relational. Each feature means more because of what lies beneath, what came before, and what still moves through it now. That relational depth is best felt slowly, and the slower you go, the more the lava plain begins to resemble another kind of archive. Not an archive of objects, an archive of transitions. Liquid to solid, surface to roof, roof to hollow, rock to substrate, substrate to moss, rain to infiltration, cold to fracture, event to ecosystem. Everywhere the eye rests, one state is leaning into the next. That is why even the most settled-looking places contain tension. Not negative tension, just stored transformation. A moss dome may seem complete, but it rests on stone that once flexed and cracked. A basin of damp green may seem soft, but its shape may come from withdrawal. A level reach of plain may seem restful, but it was emplaced by distance and heat. No single layer cancels the others. The field remains cumulative. This cumulative quality can make the plain feel almost larger in time than in space. You begin by noticing extent. You end by noticing duration. Not duration as one continuous quiet, but as many tempos layered together. Months of eruption, seasons of freezing and thawing, centuries of moss growth, longer spans of tectonics spreading beneath Iceland itself. The field sits at the crossing of those timescales. That, too, is part of its peculiar calm. Places shaped by one obvious rhythm can be grasped quickly. Places shaped by several rhythms at once remain open longer in the mind. Eldrown is open in that way. It keeps giving cause after cause without losing mood. The world has many kinds of plains, floodplains that sort sediment by water, grasslands shaped by climate and grazing, desert flats built by evaporation or wind, glacial outwash spread by meltwater. Eldrown belongs to another family entirely. Its broadness comes from lava behaving with enough fluidity to become horizontal. Its texture comes from cooling interacting with motion. Its voids come from drainage beneath crust. Its ecology comes from rough basalt being patient enough to host life. Its atmosphere comes from porosity, and low relief making weather linger differently close to the ground. And because all of that remains close to the surface, the field never fully disguises its origin. This is perhaps the most restful part of the landscape. It does not have to pretend to be gentle in the same way as older countryside. Its gentleness comes from time resting on rawness, not replacing it. That creates a calm with more depth in it, a calm that knows how it was made. The dim sky lowers another degree. What had been green becomes nearly charcoal in places. The pale light remaining in the clouds gives the plain a kind of indirect illumination, as though the field is lit from everywhere and nowhere at once. Under that light, the lava swells seem to extend without edge. The troughs between them stop reading as separate hollows and become slight pauses in a broader dark fabric. At this stage, the place feels less and less terrestrial in the familiar pastoral sense. Not because it has become hostile, because it has become abstract in the most soothing way. Pattern overtakes object. Surface overtakes feature. The mind stops asking what this one mound is and that one hollow is, and begins to rest inside the repeated answer that all of them belong to the same slow sentence of stone. When that happens, the plain becomes easier to inhabit than to summarize. And perhaps that is the finest kind of geological understanding, not mastery. What matters then is not whether every contour can be named, but whether the plain has begun to reveal the logic that holds it together. You can feel that logic most clearly when the light is low enough to simplify, but not so low that detail disappears entirely. A ridge catches a little shadow. A hollow keeps a little dampness. A dark seam interrupts the green just enough to remind you that the softness is thin. Then the eye starts to understand something difficult and quiet. This landscape is not immense because it is featureless. It feels immense because the same family of forms keeps returning without fully repeating itself. That is a different kind of scale. It does not strike all at once. It accumulates. The more those rounded moss domes continue, the more the mind loses the habit of counting them. The more the shallow troughs echo one another, the less any one of them seems final. Distance stops behaving like a sequence of landmarks and becomes a condition of continuation. That is why Eldron can feel larger than a map suggests. Not because the field tricks the eye with height, but because it withholds edges in a softer way. A distant swell looks like a nearby swell. A long green rise might be 10 steps away, or many more. The field keeps flattening the ordinary cues that help a person feel contained, and yet this is not a threatening kind of uncertainty. It is calm. It is almost lulling. The repetition gives the mind less to grasp, and so the mind begins to widen instead. There is another consequence to that repetition. It makes the plain seem strangely oceanic, even when everything about it is stone. The comparison has been near all along, because the basalt spread in broad fluid sheets. But at this stage it becomes more than a comparison of origin. It becomes a comparison of experience. A sea under cloud does not always reveal clear depth or direction. It offers pattern, rhythm, faint changes of tone, and a horizon that seems both near and unreachable. Eldrown can produce a similar feeling on land. Not with motion now, but with the memory of motion preserved in low waves of basalt. The moss helps this. It smooths small interruptions and lets the larger posture of the flow emerge. That larger posture is what the plain keeps after the fire. Not heat, not brightness, not the violence of eruption itself. It keeps the spread. It keeps the outwardness. It keeps the sense that this was once one moving body, widening over the ground, and then becoming still without ever quite becoming ordinary. That is why evening deepens the field rather than reducing it. As shadows gather, the fine distinctions between one patch of vegetation and the next begin to soften. What remains visible are the broader swells, the low channels, the lingering interruptions where rock still presses close to the surface. The plain simplifies, and in simplifying, it becomes truer to its own first shape. You stop seeing 1,000 separate moss forms. You start seeing one enormous cooled movement. That is also when the chain of causes becomes easiest to hold in one thought. A fissure opened, basalt rose. Because it was fluid, it traveled outward instead of climbing into one steep monument. Its surface cooled first. Its interior continued to move. Some pathways emptied, some roofs held, some sagged, some cracked. Then weather arrived, year after year, not to erase the field, but to begin inhabiting it. Water entered the fractures, frost widened them. Moss found purchase, thin soils gathered where the lava allowed them to gather. And so a volcanic event became a climate surface, then an ecological surface, without ever surrendering its first identity. That layered identity is the heart of the plain's strangeness. Most places become easier to classify as time passes. A fresh deposit turns into a valley floor. A volcanic slope turns into a hillside. A floodplain becomes farmland or marsh or meadow. Eldrown has changed, certainly, but it has changed in a way that keeps its beginning close. Even after centuries, the earliest chapter is still speaking through everything that came later. There is a particular quietness in that. The field is not trying to become anything else. It has accepted weather, it has accepted life, it has accepted darkness and snow and rain and low cloud, but it has accepted them on volcanic terms. That is why even the greenest parts never quite feel pastoral. They are too thinly rooted in soil, too obviously draped over roughness, too dependent on stone lying just beneath. And this is also why the plain remains partly hidden from above. A forest can conceal geology by replacing its visual language with trunks and canopy. A deep old soil can conceal lava by translating it almost completely into fertile ground. Moss does something gentler. It covers without replacing. It softens without thickening very much. It lets the original structure remain almost readable, but never fully exposed. So the field lives in a state of partial disclosure. That phrase comes close to the feeling of walking here. Nothing is secret in a dramatic sense. And yet, very little is fully given away. A hollow might be a drained root, a rise might be inflation, A dark seam might be broken clinker near a margin. A greener pocket might mark retained moisture in a sagged basin. The clues are present, but the whole plain asks you to infer more than it directly displays. This makes it unusually durable in the mind. Landscapes that explain themselves too quickly can be admired, then left behind. Eldrown lingers because it stays slightly unresolved. Even once you understand the processes, the visual experience keeps some reserve. The reserve is not mystical, it is structural. The real shape of the field includes what cannot be seen from one standing height. Its voids, fractures, rubbly layers, and moisture routes continue below the living skin. So the plain remains a surface with an interior. That fact makes even stillness seem deeper. If you imagine the basalt beneath the moss, not as one solid slab, but as a complicated arrangement of cooled crust, rough flow fronts, drained channels, and broken layers, then the quiet becomes more substantial. The field is resting, but it is not simple. It is settled, but not flat in the way a plain usually is. It is old enough to be calm, and young enough to keep its construction visible. That combination gives the place a rare kind of honesty. Nothing has been polished smooth for your understanding. The land has simply aged enough to become gentle without becoming easy. There are moments, especially under a broad grey Icelandic sky, when the plain seems to withdraw from scale altogether. The near ground remains legible. You can see the moss, the texture, the shallow dark channels, but farther out, the repeating forms begin to merge into one dark green body with no clear hierarchy. No single rise dominates. No one line controls the view. The field becomes democratic in the most geological sense. Every part belongs to the same process. Every part contributes to the same broad impression. And because of that, the landscape becomes emotionally difficult to contain. Not overwhelming, just unending, in a very low register. You can stand still and feel as if the pattern could continue far beyond what you see. In fact, in regional terms, that feeling is not wrong. Eldrun itself is extensive, but it also belongs to a country where basaltic surfaces, fissure systems, and recently made land are common enough to form a wider background. The plain is not an isolated oddity dropped into stable old terrain. It is one articulation of an island, still shaped by spreading crust and persistent volcanism. That context matters more the longer you think about it. Elsewhere, a lava field might feel like a temporary interruption in the normal order of land. Here, it feels like a quiet statement of the normal order itself. Iceland makes ground this way. Not always, and not everywhere. But often enough that a place like Eldrun reads less as anomaly and more as concentrated truth. The island is full of surfaces that remain close to their making. Glacial forms remain sharp because ice has been active until recently. River plains remain raw because sediment is still being delivered from young volcanic highlands. Geothermal areas expose heat before it has traveled far from the deep crust. And lava plains like this remain legible because climate has softened them without translating them completely into older landscape types. That is one reason Iceland can feel geologically intimate. The deeper processes are never very far away. You can sense this in Eldrun without seeing magma, without hearing steam, without any visible drama at all. The plain itself is enough evidence. It lies there as a reminder that new crust can arrive over low country in sheets, cool from the outside inward, retain hidden pathways, and then spend centuries learning how to host moss. That sequence sounds improbable only if one expects land to be made in simpler steps. Here, simplicity was never the point. The field's calm depends on complication. It depends on flow behaving like water, crust behaving like roof, emptiness becoming structure, and weather becoming interpreter. By now, the plain has almost turned the original question around. At first, the question was why this moss-covered field feels so unusual. Now the answer has become large enough that another question quietly appears beneath it. How often do we mistake softness for completion? Eldrun suggests that softness can just as easily be a covering over unresolved form. The moss feels final only until you remember what it rests upon. The calm feels permanent only until you notice how many small processes are still active. The plain feels settled only until you see how thoroughly it continues to direct water, temperature, and growth. So, the landscape teaches a kind of caution against assuming that stillness means finishing. In geological terms, stillness often means only that the pace has changed. That is certainly true here. The eruption is over. The spreading is over, but weathering is not over. Moisture movement is not over. The work of colonization is not over. The slow translation of black basalt into green habitat is still incomplete, and because it is incomplete, the plain remains poised between categories. A field, but not a meadow. A volcanic deposit, but not bare. A young surface, but one carrying enough weather to seem ancient in mood. This poise is part of what makes the lava plain restful to look at for so long. The mind keeps finding a balance it cannot quite settle. Too green to call raw, too raw to call fully grown, too broad to call intricate at first glance, too intricate to call simple after any real attention. A landscape like that does not tire easily. It keeps rewarding slowness. There is also the matter of touch, even when imagined rather than enacted. From a distance, the moss appears plush, almost velvety. It rounds the lava into soft forms and invites the old habit of thinking that green surfaces must be forgiving. But the truth underneath is more exacting. Basalt cools into roughness. Clinker margins are jagged. Collapsed crust can hide angles and gaps. Even on gentle rises, the skin of living growth may be quite thin over abrasive stone. That contrast matters because it sums up the entire field in miniature. Tenderness above, severity below, neither cancelling the other. Each depending on the other. Without the rough, porous rock, the moss would not hold the same moisture pattern. Without the moss, the rock would reveal its harshness too directly for the larger forms to read so calmly. Together they create the strange visual tenderness of Eldran. In that tenderness, the history of fire is not erased, it is translated. Translation is the better word here, because it preserves continuity. Erasure would mean the eruption vanished beneath later processes. It did not. It remains visible in every low swell. Translation means the same forms now speak through different materials. Where there was once fluid basalt, there is now moss over basalt. Where there was once heat traveling in roofed pathways, there may now be cold air collecting in hidden hollows. Where there was once molten movement beneath crust, there is now moisture moving through fractures beneath living cover. The architecture persists. Only the substances and tempos have changed. That persistence is why the field can feel alive without being animated. A desert dune field feels alive because wind visibly remakes it. A river feels alive because it is in open motion. Eldran feels alive in a quieter way. Its activity is mostly internal, seasonal, incremental. It is alive in the sense that it continues to sort what enters it. A rainfall arrives, and the field answers differently in different places. A winter storm arrives, and snow settles unevenly across hidden relief. A thaw arrives, and the old channels and porous layers decide where water disappears, where it lingers, where it returns. The plain is a participant in every season, not passive ground. There is a deeper comfort in that than one might expect. A place that still behaves has more presence than one merely left behind. Eldran is not an abandoned eruption, it is an ongoing arrangement. And the arrangement is so well balanced that the eye can move across it without feeling strain. Everything happens in low tones. Nothing breaks the mood by insisting too loudly on itself. Even exposed rock usually appears as dark undernote rather than interruption. Even hollows remain shallow enough to be read slowly. Even the ecological differences between one patch and the next stay within a restrained palette. Dark green, muted grey-green, black, brown where thin organic material gathers, pale sky above. This limited range of color does something important. It keeps the plain coherent while allowing detail to accumulate. A richer landscape might offer more immediate beauty. Eldron offers a quieter kind, one built from restraint. That restraint allows form to matter. It allows the broad wave-like posture of the lava to remain visible under every season and every weather. If you imagine the field before the moss, the forms might appear harsher, more broken, more obviously volcanic. If you imagine it thousands of years from now, with deeper soils and more complete ecological change, the forms might be harder to read. So there is something timely about Eldron as it exists now. Not temporary in a brief sense, but balanced in a particular interval of landscape history, young enough to preserve emplacement, old enough to carry patience. That interval is a major part of its beauty. It may also be why the field feels emotionally quieter than many other volcanic places. There is no spectacle left to distract from process, no cone glowing at dusk, no ash in the air, no plume, no sound of eruption, only aftermath with enough structure remaining to keep the first event close. This is what gives Eldron its unusual density of meaning. The field is quiet but not empty of story. It is soft, but not soft in origin. It is broad, but not blank. Everything visible now is the result of many small negotiations between what the lava did first and what weather and life have done since. You can see this especially clearly where the moss grows thickest in the low basins. At first these spots look like rest, and they are. But they are also records of shape. The basin was available because crust sagged or drained that way. Sediment gathered because the relief allowed it. Moisture remained because the texture and slight shelter held it. The moss thickened because those earlier conditions aligned. So even the most tender patch of green is a layered consequence. Nothing here is decorative. Everything has been earned through cause and effect. The same can be said of the drier rises. A low-pressure ridge may stand just enough above its surroundings to shed water more quickly. Wind may dry it a little faster, snow may linger less uniformly there, the moss cover may remain thinner. Exposed fragments of lava may appear more often through the green. The result is still subtle, but the logic is the same. Microtopography governs microclimate, microclimate governs colonization. Colonization feeds back into moisture retention. The plain remains one continuous lesson in how geologic texture becomes ecological pattern. And because the pattern is so finely scaled, the landscape keeps more intricacy than its broad form first suggests. That is why the field resists both romantic simplification and scientific reduction. To call it simply beautiful misses the mechanisms that made the beauty possible. To call it simply a basalt flow misses the tenderness acquired through time. What is needed is a way of seeing that lets process and feeling coexist. Eldron almost requires that. You have to admit the roughness under the moss and the softness of the moss itself. You have to hold eruption and colonization together. You have to let the field be both memory and present system. Once you do, the strangeness stops feeling like an obstacle to understanding. It becomes the understanding. A landscape can be strange because it is contradictory. This one is stranger because its contradictions fit. That is a rarer thing. By now, evening has thinned the visible textures into a slower arrangement of tones. The plain feels broader again. The low ridges are still there, but they no longer separate the surface into distinct units so easily. What had been many become fewer. What had been complex becomes calm. And in that calm, the original idea returns once more, but changed by everything that has been learned. This is not land that failed to become a field. It is land that became a field in volcanic terms. A field made by pouring, cooling, draining, weathering, and greening. A field whose softness is inseparable from the stone that resists softness. A field whose most peaceful quality is its refusal to forget how it formed. That refusal is gentle. It comes not as exposed violence, but as posture. As low wave after low wave. As hidden channel after hidden channel. As moisture patterns still obeying old fractures. As moss still draped over incomplete solidity. The plain keeps after the fire exactly what the fire could not help leaving behind: shape. And shape is enough. Enough to organize water, enough to organize life, enough to organize feeling, enough to make the landscape remain subtly other than ordinary ground. This is where the quiet question at the beginning becomes more precise. Why does Eldraun seem less like a normal plain and more like a surface that stopped mid-transformation? Because, in a very real sense, it did. The lava became solid before all movement had ceased within it. The ecology arrived before deep soils had hidden the basalt. The weather softened the field before it made it familiar. So every stage began before the previous one had been fully resolved. The result is overlap. And overlap is exactly what the eye senses as strangeness. One process visible through another, one age resting on another, one material translated into another without losing its outline. If you stay with that idea, the field becomes even calmer. There is no need to force the landscape into one identity. It does not need to be only a lava field, only a moss plain, only a post-eruption ecosystem. It is all of those at once. And in the low, darkening light, that layered reality seems to settle over the entire spread of Eldraun like the weather itself. The moss lies close, the basalt lies closer, the hidden cavities and rough pathways lie below that. The deep tectonic setting lies below even that, slow and patient, still opening Iceland by increments too small to feel directly. The whole plain is suspended between those depths and the evening air. And because of that, even standing still here can feel like listening to several timescales at once. The months of eruption are present in the broad geometry. The centuries of colonization are present in the living cover. The daily weather is present in the dampness, the low cloud, the cooling surface. The geological making of Iceland is present in the fact that such a field exists at all. Few landscapes gather their time so gently. Fewer still gather them without losing simplicity of appearance. Eldraun does. That is why it keeps drawing thought back to it. Not because it is unresolved in a frustrating way, because it is unresolved in a fertile way. It remains open. The more you know, the more the plain gains structure. But it never becomes closed. A place like that can stay with you for years, not as a spectacle remembered, but as a pattern